Are we rolling?
I think we are.
We're rolling, okay. My name's Jim Shackelford, and this is Trent Deckard, who's running for County Council. And I'm going to jump right in with the questionnaire that I gave County Council candidates. And David Henry did a little interview with me on camera. We're going to do one with Trent. Some of the other people are going to submit these in writing. I'm going to jump right in. First question, what should voters know about the job of County Councilor?
Well, the county council's large primary duty is that they're funding the needs and the values essentially of the county, and that comes in a couple different ways. It comes from the departments, some of which are under other elected officials, some of which are under department heads or even appointed boards such as the Board of Health, and it funds what they do, what they fulfill, what they do, particularly for the taxpayer of the county, the residents of the county. It also funds our very vital county employees. And so when we think of what a county councilor does, you spend a lot of your time thinking about how are folks compensated, how are they trained, what do they need in that regard so that they're in the best position to serve ultimately the service or the taxpayer themselves. And so it really comes down to that. And in that role, you deal with a lot of different things because all things do require some sort of support or they require some sort of consideration for what would this cost, how would we do that, how do you do it long term. So that is the biggest thing I think people need to know. We're different than city council. And we get a lot of confusion with them. City council can look at ordinance. We don't necessarily look at ordinance unless the ordinance would have a cost or it would have a requirement that for abatement or for investment, something would be there that would affect our budget or the bottom line of what the county brings in.
Okay. How long have you been on County Council?
I joined County Council in January of 2019. I believe it was the 14th. I took Lee Jones's place when she became a commissioner in the 2018 election. So I started when there was a vacancy then, and I served the remainder of the 2 years of her term and was elected in my own right in 2020. So altogether my service is about, I believe it's 5 years, 2 months. Exactly.
Yeah.
Somewhere around about
So these are 4-year terms?
4-year terms. And whoever would take this seat, the 3 at-large members that would be elected, they would serve from January of 2025 on through 26, 27, 28, and then in January of 29, we get new councilors.
What are the issues? What are the issues you want to make sure are discussed well in this campaign?
Well, one thing that we did not know when I filed in 2020 was that we would have a pandemic. We did not know that. And we had to quickly, while I was in office from filling out the remaining term to in that campaign year itself, we had to respond quickly to the pandemic. And that meant making sure that folks received essential services, that we operated as best as we could. I want people to, as they think about county council, which sometimes they don't think about county council. We were kind of talking about that.
Yeah.
I want them to think about leaders that will respond to new challenges that come to the county. Literally, that's how the job works. What we were talking about in January 2019 is certainly different than today. And so it's the job, while I'm a huge contextualist with history, that's like my vocation and my love, it's really about what will happen in the future and building from that context to make decisions. And so that's going to be a lot of range of issues, how we elect people, literally our ballot box. Democracy's at stake. I say that, sometimes people think that's alarmist, but after 2020, I don't think we can necessarily say that's alarmist at all. It's alarming what happened. How we live and work and play in this community is at stake. We have a massive affordability issue. My family, which is 9 generations in the community, my daughters are the 9th. If they were buying the house that my parents bought in the late 70s in Van Buren Addition, I'm not sure that my family would be able to afford that. So housing affordability is huge. And just basically I want to make sure that a big positive message about elected officials working together is in the mix this year. And I say this a lot, and sometimes people say I'm a little Pollyanna-ish on this positive message that elected officials can work together, they can get good things done, and when they do, they can give constituents something to be proud of. I really believe that, and it's why I'm in public service now. It's why I'm going to stay in it for as long as, this term and how people need me. But we can do a better job working together at the local level, state level, and federal level, certainly. And we can set that example here. There's no reason it has to be acrimonious.
More you want to add there?
What's that?
Anything more you want to say under that? The issues you want to see discussed in this campaign?
No, I think that is kind of it. I would say that the voters are very funny about telling you what issues they want to talk about. I was in a neighborhood meeting in the Broadview Broadview neighborhood last night, as a matter of fact, and we were sort of talking about justice and the new correctional facility discussion, and they wanted to talk about issues related to homelessness. And I tend to kind of keep my ear out on what people want to talk about, what is important to them. Those will be two massive issues that we talk about in this year. We have been talking about them in the last year, but essentially, I think folks will tell us a lot of what they want to talk about, and they'll want answers on those things, much like these questions.
Yeah. Is there an important issue you'll push forward that might have 80 to 99% disagreement from the public initially? That's
a really good question.
Yeah, thank you. No.
When I saw that on your list, I was like, that's interesting. And I don't really have a prepared answer for that other than to say the following. It's my observation, again, I've done some work in federal, state, and local government now. What happens often is it's the implementation of something where you get to severe opposition. We watched it in 2008 when President Obama at the time was really pushing through both energy and healthcare reform. And it was the details that people really got fired up about. It's the same here. If we say, we're for new community justice approaches. Everybody's going to applaud on that. You could probably poll on that and find unison. When you get into details, that's where it matters. And so I think that it's always how things are done. And one thing we know in this community, border to border in this county, people have strong thoughts on how things are done. And one thing I think that they do well is they tell us how they feel about it. We need to do a better job of getting that opinion. But I always hear ample thoughts on how we get things done. And so it could be implementation around a new jail, new correctional center. It could be housing. We say housing, we need more housing.
Everybody agrees.
Everybody agrees. When you get into here's what the house will look like, here's where it will go, here's its composition.
How many on per acre?
Heck yeah. And that is a massive discussion. I will say the commissioner's race that we're in right now, there's a big discussion on housing, and I'm glad for that.
Yeah.
They have more direct influence on that than the county council, and I'm glad they're talking about it, because I think for a long time we didn't talk about that. We should have been talking about it more often. We have a good headache here, not to kind of digress, but we have a good headache. People want to be in this community. There's something to be here for. Not every southern Indiana community has that. We need to kind of honor that and then figure out, with this headache, which is a good headache to have, how do we put people here? How do they live? The last thing I'll just say, I come from a family that was affected by the RCA layoffs. Mm-hmm. My late father, lost him in December. Literally, he was at RCA and those jobs went away. We're not in that point of time here in this community, but we could quickly be in that. And if we are, we're going to want to make sure we have housing, workforce, and people roughly occupying both of those. And so we have to have a keen eye to that at all times.
Next question, what are the most important distinctions between you and the others in this election race?
Well, they're all good people.
I'm going to name them for the folks out there. In this race, we have 4 people running for 3 spots. Trent Deckard is one, David Henry is another, Cheryl Munson, an incumbent, is another, and Matt Colley is the fourth.
Yeah. I've enjoyed meeting every single one of them over time. Cheryl and I have been on the council now in my 5 years. Chairman David Henry, being party chair, which I did at one time in my life, he's done it longer than I have, and that is a hard job. And then Matt, I've met recently, and I've enjoyed talking with him. I'd like to get to know him a little bit better. As far as differences between us, you know, we all have varying levels of experience, and you will hear people say that experience doesn't matter, and that it's not a part of what we do. I'll say this. In a lot of what the county does for its work, where it has to work between multiple departments, and the county's kind of built weird. It's you've got different elected officials over different things. Sheriff's over both his deputies and the jail, surveyors over land, coroner over that are passing from the earth in some cases. The courts, several different elected officials between prosecutor and judge, and that doesn't even get into the unappointed department heads such as public defenders. And that's a kind of a state partnership. But all of that, you have to understand a little bit about how things get done, what can happen, what cannot happen, and what you have to do to protect whatever asset you have. And I think experience does matter in that. I have worked for a member of Congress as a district director, as a field representative. I have run a state agency. I was the chief of staff for a legislative caucus. I've not always done those jobs well.
Can I insert
Yeah.
a question? What was the state agency that you ran?
I was co-director of the Indiana Election Division, from January of 2011 till about July of 2014 or 2015 when I left to go over to the Indiana House to serve as chief of staff for then Minority Leader Scott Pelath. I loved running a state agency as a co-director. In fact, it was a bipartisan agency, so you have a Democrat and a Republican. I love that because I learned a lot about you're not going to get everything you want. You have got to figure out what you need to get done and how you do that in sometimes an artful way, sometimes a frustrating way. But there's something to that experience of learning that, so that when I go meet with our assessor and she says, hey, look, here's what we need, and I say, there's not everything I can do here, but let me figure out what we can and what do we need to do to make sure that folks are served and our employees are getting what they need. There's something to that. And I do think I bring a mix to that and knowledge of the community and a little bit of optimism for the future that I think blends well. All the candidates are good people, and the community will be served by all of them in some capacity, hopefully in the next 4 to 5 years or so. But I do think I bring that, and I hope to always add value to the mix with that.
So that's the experience side of it. In office functioning, what distinctions would you expect between you and any of the other candidates or some of them?
Yeah.
Question makes sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, one thing, my style is, I will say this, I'm not going to be the most confrontational office holder or candidate out there.
Yeah.
I am not ever going to use the word my plan on anything. I'm not knocking anyone that does, but my experience has taught me that it's never one person's plan that comes out in a solution. It's ultimately people working around a table trying to figure out what they need to get done, what can get done, and trying to cut past some of the rhetoric. And so my style is a lot to listen a lot, to kind of come in discussion where it's appropriate and say, hey, have we thought about this? That's going to be the working style I have. I think that style is why my colleagues on the council have put me in leadership the last 3 years as presiding officer of the meeting, which is a minor function generally to the public, but if you're watching a meeting that's running and happening and good discussions on both sides of an issue are happening, it's because we're having good, timely debate. I think that's why they put me in that role, both as president pro tem for 2 years and now council president, which is a tremendous honor.
Somebody told me the other day at my kitchen table, you should see him run a meeting. That just came out of the blue. We were discussing you for some reason, but it didn't relate to that. But we're probably talking about strengths and weaknesses, and that was a strength that person named, and they said it real definitively.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate hearing that. One thing is I try to govern with tenderness, and here's what I mean by that. If you hear the public reacting sharply on something or other officials reacting, you have to recognize this is ultimately it's a community where we're neighbors, friends, and we're not that big. We're big, but we're not as big as we sometimes think. And I try to keep a tenderness towards, are we bringing people along or are we telling people? Mm-hmm. And if we're not bringing them or educating them, and think we've seen issues in the community that got a little hot at times. The city definitely has a harder job in that regard. That city council is tackling tough issues in a real focalized area. But when you see people kind of having a moment, my question always is, who was told? How was the communication? Was there any listening? Was there another way to do this, have this discussion so that it's productive? And look, it's never going to be perfect, but if we can take out some of the hard parts, I think we do a better job.
Okay. Now the council role is different than the commissioners, but I'm going to pursue that question a little more, this basic question of distinctions on issues. If we think about land use, we think about the jail, we think about pay levels in the county. Any issues that you all are dealing with, do you see distinctions there?
Well, one thing that I'm proud about in the last 5 years or so in this council, I believe that we've tried to respond well to our county employees and their needs. We probably, if you were to get them in a room and say, I'm not going to tell them anything you said, and hopefully, I don't think you'd have to do that. They'd be pretty honest about pay and those things. I think they would say in the last few years especially, both with retention bonuses to keep people when everyone was losing people, including us, and with COLA adjustments that were pretty strong for public service, for the public sector. And I base that on just federal and state experience and local experience. I think they'd say that this council in the last 5 years, at least since I've been there, we've been responsive to that. We bought training for them, and that we're keeping an ear out for those tender spots that I was talking about. Is this department getting what they need? Are they being treated fairly compared to others? And that's always tough with the county. You can always make a case for different things, but ultimately fairness between. As far as distinctions, I keep an open eye to that, and I listen to that. I do that because I was a staff member for a member of Congress. I worked at the state, and I just know that if people are not happy, they're not going to be productive. And that if they're exhausted because we have not classified jobs right or somebody's doing too much, that you may be there on Friday, but you may not be there on Friday because you're checked out or you're exhausted. And so I try to always kind of lead with that. I'm real sensitive with the notion that we have to fund our folks that make those services go. I don't know that anyone would not be that way, but I do know that I'm running against, or whoever's running for this, but I know that I think about that. And one of the reasons I think about it is I'm the son of a court reporter. My mom, now retired from the county, literally worked for the county at a time when we did not supply vision insurance. And as a kid, I didn't know any different. I can remember her being at Dr. Polling's office, shoving cash across to get me my contacts and glasses before that. And I just said, Mom, why didn't you not get out the card? Why are you paying cash? And she was like, well, they don't offer that. Mm-hmm. Well, we're well past those days. And I always like to remind folks that we're always on a progression of treating our people better, because ultimately that dignity they get, that recognition they get, helps them when they're dealing with that tough counter issue, whether it's someone coming in to get a permit, registering to vote, whatever it is, it's going to help them in that tough moment. Our courts alone, the tough stuff they deal with, I just want them to know that we have their back in that. So I don't know if I answered you well, but
it's not the easiest question for the four of you in this race. Mm-hmm. One, the nature of the job, mm-hmm. and two, that you're not like way different on issues. But also, it's one of the, when people go to vote, that's what they're looking for is distinction. So we may actually come back to it at the end.
Yeah.
Question 5. 1 or 2 forums, or even more, may ask you to go into depth about affordable housing. So I won't do that here. But is there a sentence or two you could offer voters on this that will help them in their election day choices? And this questionnaire goes out to people in writing, so I'm going to tell him the last part. And in parentheses, I tell them there may not be. If that's the case, it's fine. But is there anything you could say quickly on that? Because I think it will get covered elsewhere.
Sure. We've got people that want to be here, and that's a good headache to have. I think that the county needs to be, and the city too, I think all of us, township, but county and city largely have this obligation. I think we need to be realistic about what our needs are, what people's needs are, and if we're truly so overpriced that people cannot come here to make a start, what that's going to do to our economy.
Yeah.
And I go back to it. Even the house I'm in right now, which I bought with my then wife at the time. We later divorced, but I bought that house in 2007. I do not believe I'd be able to buy the house today. Even now, my career progressing, I've got a good job at the teaching at the IU, serving even on the county. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah.
That alarms me. We cannot have that. And I think that we've got to be mindful of that. We've got to be mindful about space that could be used. We have, and I know I'm going way too long
here.
You're
fine.
But we've got these existing communities that 200 years ago, folks like my family, when they came, settled around Smithville, Harrodsburg, Clear Creek. Those are existing places where homes can be. Now, I'm not saying like 5 million homes in Smithville tomorrow.
Right.
But if you have a community center that you said 200 years ago with the state, give or take a few years, this is going to be where people live, then you can have people live there. And so the county, I think, needs to be a leader on that. That means infrastructure. It means investment. We can't just say, well, we had a town, or we could have people in these areas and not have them. I think we have to be realistic on that. Or we'll wind up in a situation where either people can't be here, people are already telling me that, we're not going to be able to be here, period. Mm-hmm. Or B, we get into a rut and we will want to beg for people to come, and we will not be able to accommodate that. And that stuff keeps me up a little bit late. Okay. I don't like that. Sorry, I went on way too long.
No. One of the things I should say to the viewers is that I started this with David Henry, and it didn't come out of nowhere. David's been reading me for a year or two and notices that I say candidates need to tell the public more.
Yes.
Candidates need to tell them. And I'm talking about during campaigns rather than 5 issues, and we know you're responsive to these. Mm-hmm. So these two gentlemen are responding. They're basically agreeing with me that, yeah, let's tell people more. Yeah. So no problem with length. Another big question. What should we do with respect to the jail? Please be as concrete as possible. And then I'm giving an and/or, and it's a quote from you as far as what people can spin off of. So you said at a recent event, that has to get done in reference to the jail. You said that Monroe County Sheriff Ruben Marte has a powerful vision for the jail and is being exceedingly transparent about what is happening in the jail, about what he wants to see happen. Mm-hmm. We should honor that vision. So going either way, what would you like to tell people about the jail here? Sure.
So I believe that what the sheriff is telling us, what our recent report is telling us, is that the existing structure, and this is anecdotally we're hearing this, that the existing structure is not working. When we got, and when I say we got, I mean the community, in 1986, roughly, I think I'm right on my year there, but when the new jail, or the current jail, came into that 4th floor of the Justice Building in 1986, that was seen as a really good compromise effort to save the courthouse, put court somewhere other than the courthouse, and kind of expanded to where the county was. We have no other jail in the state on top of that much floorage. None that anyone's ever been able to tell me in the region. And what was once this will work has really shown its age in what is not working. The one thing I really appreciate, many things I appreciate about the sheriff, is he's in our meeting, or his folks are in our meeting, at least every other meeting, updating us on programming, conditions for the prisoners that are inside, who are residents at this time. He's updating us on that all the time. Or here's what we painted, here's what we cleaned, here's what this looks like. Here's some of the feedback that we get, and I appreciate that. He's also made clear that the existing structure is just not working. We've had an elevator that they're trying to get replacement parts for. This is problematic. So I truly believe that both that, the jail being where it's located, and the rest of the building the Justice Building is no longer sustainable in its current capacity. Something new must be done. The question then becomes what location, and the county's on an effort to find that location. Sort of my strong preferences on that is it must absolutely be accessible. And accessibility means that people can get there and both have access to the courts, to the clerk, have access to the services that they need from all of that, have access to the judicial system, and that means transit, it means a footpath to get there, and those are the details that we would have to work out along with that location.
So with the one that was discussed real recently, that's sort of north of town,
yes.
Is that close enough? Is that what you would call accessible?
I think that if that were the location, much would have to be done to make that exceedingly more accessible.
So you need shuttle buses.
You would have to have shuttle, you have to have transit. And generally, I do think we need to look generally in this county for transit access, period, in locations that are not covered. Monroe Hospital, a good example,
yeah.
is a location not on a transit line.
Yeah.
Every meeting I'm in that we're talking about transit, I bring that up because people act like that's normal. That is not normal.
No. No.
That is not normal.
And it assumes that everybody could get there by car.
Right.
And obviously they can't.
Right. When my dad entered his 2 years of sickness before ultimately passing, at the very beginning it was at Monroe Hospital. And I would sit in there for many days and kind of listen to not only kind of transportation access issues, but I'd listen to, what's our ambulance count? What's going on? And sometimes people tell me something they didn't know I was on county council. They would give me really candid, here's what's, stuff to be aware of. So that transit question, to kind of get back to the jail, has got to be answered. That can't be glossed over.
Yeah.
People have got to be able to get there.
And one of my concerns about that would be that somebody has a relative, and this would apply to many people, they have a relative in the jail, and it's very difficult for them to get there simply to visit.
Right. And get a protective order from the clerk to do any sort of need that they have that question has to be answered. Yeah. But we do generally, if you look at the community, we've got a whole mess of transportation issues we have to deal with. The Ellettsville, sometimes people say in Ellettsville the population isn't growing that much. I actually think it's growing a lot. They've got some rural transit issues that I've been working on trying to get them connected. And so generally, I think we're heading down a path, period, in the community where more transportation, more access, not less, is going to have to be the order of the day. I don't see that going back. If you said, bet on what's going to happen next 20, 30 years, less transit, less transportation, I'd bet my mortgage that's not going to happen because the community need is there. So we have to look at all of that. The one thing about that northern property is it does need transportation access and transit, and that is something we'd have to figure out. Shuttling or whatever that might be at any time of the day or any time of the night where those functions are happening. So if a sheriff's letting someone out at 7 o'clock, one thing that I would love to see in a location like that is that we have a sort of a hub spot of social service kind of net providers who have representatives there that say, what is it you might need? Or that programming is sort of integral to that exit process. How are you doing on closed? Where do you think you're heading next? What can we tell you about how to get there? I think all that has to be answered because we're not of the system of 40 to 50 years ago where let someone out of the Waldron and then now the Waldron. We're in a system where we've got to be really mindful of what people need, where they're going, where life is hitting them at a very difficult time for them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm going to move on. That one we could easily devote an hour to. The reason I'm kind of going short on that one is because I think it's going to get hit in other forums.
Oh, yeah.
So I encourage everybody to watch forums, to look at other media like Dave Askins, P-Square Beacon. That will get covered. Next question, do you think our county payroll now has too many positions? Is it too big in that respect? Why or why not? And I'm making the assumption here that any cuts would come from attrition. But is the payroll not the amount of money people are making, but the amount of positions there? Is it inflated in some way, or even inflated by 2 positions?
Well, one thing is I don't often hear that any service or county function is too inflated. If anything, I hear the opposite. You know, anytime I talk to an elected official who runs a department or a department head, they will say, I appreciate this, here's what I really would need. But we do look at literally and department heads and elected officials will tell you this can be an exhaustive process. We look at every job classification. In 2021, we went through a complete system-wide reclassification with our, we have an outside vendor that helps us. They use Bureau of Labor Statistics. They use standards to try to make sure that we're as close to or not deviating in some significant way from what other counties might do or other public service roles might occupy. So I don't really think about cuts. And one thing that we tried hard to do in the pandemic when the outlook did not look good is to figure out quickly how do we not cut folks to then not cut services, because no matter what happens, whether it's me or whoever, they're going to expect someone at that health desk, and it's better that it's probably not me in many cases. But we had built up, and this precedes me, it was other counselors. Counselor Jeff McKim is a good example. We had built up healthy rainy day funds. We even had food and beverage tax dollars that went to local businesses, and that all helped us a little bit during the pandemic. I would say that the need in this community and what we offer is probably not going to decrease. I'm going to give you an example. The Department of Health of today, if I had to eat my mortgage or go out on a limb and say a bet on my mortgage, I'd say that the need will only expand, particularly as the state passes more to us. And so, if anything, we probably will be evaluating roles for efficiencies to do it better, make sure we're not just ringing this bell every day through this one role because we've done it forever, but that it has a significant meaning. We'll probably do things like that, but I do believe in government. There are people that run for office who don't. I'm not saying any of my opponents, but they don't believe that there's a solution. But I will tell you this, I've been through flood events in this community, and when a flood happens, they expect someone will show up, and often it's either our first responders, it's our emergency management folks, or it's folks with United Way. And folks don't really care about theoreticals of bigger government or less government. They want services. They don't really care about partisanship, and they want things done. And I kind of see the community like that, where the need will likely continue to increase. We have to control what we spend on because we can't fund everything, but they expect those services to happen in this community.
Okay. Where do you find our community, in this case Monroe County, to be pretend progressive, more talk than real action? Yeah. And do you anticipate ways you can speak that will narrow the gap between talk and action?
One thing I talk a lot about, and I do this with a lot of students, as a matter of fact, when we talk about issues related to climate change, I think we should be talking about that in this community. But I think we need to be more narrow. In this community, I think we always need to be talking about flooding, which will come with climate change. We already now have flooding issues, massive flooding issues, and that issue extends from downtown to border in rural areas. So anything that we're looking at related to climate change, I think flooding, water control generally should probably be the way that we are talking pretty directly about that, because I think people can respond and they get that, and they can also start to get, here's what this will do, here's how this will benefit. So that's what, I don't know that that's pretend, but that's one way where we need to
go. It's a little different, but that's fine. It's good to introduce that thought.
I also think that we sometimes I don't know. In this community, we want to always value that we're welcoming, and I think that we're not always real mindful that we're being the most welcoming in the community. Everything in my life has been about trying to be a positive ear, a welcoming soul. Sometimes it's my faith that guides me to that, but generally my public service spirit has always been around that. And I have noticed in this community that we find a reason not to have a lot of things near us. And whether you're calling that NIMBY issues, and I've had people tell me, you can't use that term, that's mean, that's awful, or it's other issues. I just think we need to be more mindful of, are we issuing a welcoming spirit to people? Are we thinking about that at all? And what do we mean by that? The cool thing about being in a 9th-generation townie, and look, my eyes haven't seen all of that, but I've heard a lot of stories. The cool thing is, my family can think back to times when the community was a lot different and it grew. And sometimes people think, well, the townie's always going to want it to stay the same. No, we've seen a lot of the change, and we know that everything's going to be different. The business next door to us, I remember when it was a video store. Now they've repaired my iPhone like 13 times. That's change that you can think about, and I love that context. I think in this community we have to keep an open mind about the way things could be, will be, and ultimately that the community underneath it is still going to have the same kind of values and cool things that we all love and why we're here. But I think we need to be a little gentler on ourselves in both welcoming, being open to things, being near us and new us. It doesn't mean shouldn't be public input. Good heavens, we want that. But we just, I think we always want to be a welcoming community.
What important issues do you plan to not address bluntly during the campaign, as you think it could affect your electability?
Oof.
This is a question I ask almost every candidate in some way.
I will say this: I'm open to being beat in the election. I've had a really good public service run, and I like people. I will say this: if you run for office or you serve the public, if you don't like people, and I used to meet people, particularly in the legislature, who didn't like people, and I don't know how that happens. But you got to be open to the public's judgment, and I don't know. I think those things happen in their own ways, and if there's something I'm ducking or not talking about, people would hold me accountable to that. I really can't think of anything that I would not want to talk about.
It's a little bit less germane to the county council job as opposed to mayor or city council and things like that. I think there are more controversial races, and there is sometimes some ducking going on.
We can be kind
whether
of
they
boring.
admit it or not.
We're fun boring.
Yeah.
One thing I'll say is, and I said this to the last mayor, and I think I've said it to our new mayor, they have a hard job. They have a very hard job.
Sure.
And there's a reason why 9,000 people aren't running for that job. And the one thing I kind of, even when Mayor Hamilton was in office and the county and the city would have sharp disagreements on things, I said that to him a lot. I said, Mayor, you have a hard job. But ultimately, everybody, whatever the territory, everybody loves this place. That's the cool thing. That's why they fight. They love it, and they want it to be special, or they want it to not lose that, and that's good. But I think that generally politics can get a little out of control if you let it get out of control. I always think it's important for elected officials and candidates, because you're auditioning there, you're showing how you'll govern with how you campaign, to temper those things by creating places where dialogue actually can happen. Ideas can get exchanged. It's a foundation of society, and that's where we have to kind of calm it. Politics can let you get swept up into weird things. And anything you wanted to ask about that I've maybe not talked about as far as controversial issues?
No.
Okay.
And I won't go into that in this conversation anyway, because in the questionnaires, other people are just going to get the question without dialoguing with me.
Yeah.
But In other campaigns, I might have, that may come from a specific place when I ask that. In this, it's just a question I ask candidates. I actually haven't noticed dodging yet. If you don't think other forums will give enough chance to address land use planning issues in Monroe County for voters, please do that here.
Sure.
If you think that's covered well elsewhere, can you give voters just a short answer here that helps them understand your approach to land use planning?
Yeah. So the county council's got one member that goes on the planning commission, so that's our one vote. I've never served in that role. We've had some great people that have, both Jeff McKim and Cheryl Munson. One day I suspect if I'm still serving, I might rotate into that, but I've not done it. I generally, when it comes to land use and how that's done, I kind of have two distinct philosophies. And I've heard a lot of other things, but my kind of philosophy comes down to this. I want to make sure that folks can reasonably understand what they can do with their property, how that gets done, and what their relationship with the county is going to be in that process. That's the first thing. The second thing is I want to make sure that whatever they're doing is not going to have a negative, detrimental effect on their neighbor. And so, if they're pouring something out their window they should be pouring, I don't want that to happen. And I suspect that, there's a lot of nuance that gets added to and around that and inches away from curbs and all that. But ultimately, I think it's that simple. I had a family member, my father, I talked about earlier, he passed, and my grandmother had some property that he maintained. And I was looking at it to figure out, what can I do with this? What should I do with it? What do I need to be maintaining as I take this over on behalf of our family? It's been in the family since the late 60s. What do I need to do and what do I need to know? And I have to say, as I looked at the county documents on it, not all those answers were clear. And one of the things I thought about, if the at-large president of the county council can't look at that and figure that out, what do we need to say differently so that that's clear? I just want people to know that and not have a mystery or a bureaucratic process. And I'm not saying that that generally happens, but I do hear from people that they're unsure or they don't think they can do this here, or life starts to look better in a different county to do business. And while we're not that other county, I want to keep people here as much as possible. And we can do that in some controlled ways, but generally, we're smart people. It's an old saying, but if we put a man on the moon in 1969, we can surely figure out a way to communicate clearly. Here's what you can do with this parcel, and here's how that is reasonable to you. So that's just some rough thoughts.
I'm going to roll back up to question 4. Have you anything else you want to say to people here that helps them distinguish as they go to vote? We have Matt Cawley, we have David Henry, Cheryl Munson, Trent Deckard. You can only vote for 3. Any other additional thoughts on that?
Well, you got good choices there. I will say this, and I kind of double down on this. People that see my yard signs know I say, our friend Trent Deckard. My wife and I literally came up with that. She designed that sign, and it's the best thing I think I ever saw, in my own opinion. I've had people tell me that they don't like it. They hate it. They want issues. They want something a little bit harsher. And I just don't want people to know me like that. I want them to literally, and I've got a lot of friends here, I'm not going to lie. I've got a lot of neighbors that I know and people that I get to interact with. And I want them to always look at me like that. I could call Trent Deckard and talk with him and tell him or email him, or he'll be approachable. He's not going to yell at me. I want them to have that feeling for me in some way. If you look at that out there as a voter, whoever might be listening to this, and you're like, that's not my shtick. I want this guy a little bit more meaner or whatever, I'm just not going to do that. And I get enough of that on my nightly news. And so ultimately, that's kind of where I'm at. I do not look at everything as purely DNR or purely theoretical. I mean, I'm a third-year PhD student. And I look at theory there, but in my public service, I look wholeheartedly at, what's really going on here, what's happening, what do we do, and how do we be approachable. And I think if folks look at that and they're like, I think at least one of those 3 positions should be that kind of a person, they should go for me. if they look at that and they're like, I'm not so sure about that, I think they should definitely pick somebody else. And that's kind of how elections work. And I worked hard to keep elections like that for the state, and hopefully we'll always be that way.
Good place to stop.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yep. We got to turn this off.
We do.